In this episode, we speak with Dr. Wei Ke, a partner at Oliver Wyman. Wei brings over 15 years of consulting experience helping global financial institutions and consumer brands drive growth through product innovation, pricing strategy, and digital sales effectiveness. Wei was recognized as one of the top 25 marketing and sales consultants and leaders of 2024. Oliver Wyman is a global management consulting firm known for guiding organizations through critical challenges by combining deep industry expertise with collaborative, insight-driven solutions. I'm your host, RJ Lumba. We hope you enjoy the show. If you like the episode, click to follow.
RJ Lumba is the executive chairman of Market Insight Media and managing partner of Growth Cap. He is the host of Top Consultant, a podcast featuring today's best consultants who advise and provide services to corporations, governments, nonprofits, and other organizations. Executives and key decision makers tune in to Top Consultant to identify the most knowledgeable and experienced consultants for their most important projects.
Wei, thank you so much for taking the time. It's great to be with you.
Likewise. Nice to meet you, RJ.
So, I think it's very interesting to talk about pricing, especially with you who has like a deep background in it, not only experience-wise, but also in academia. So maybe where we could start is the application of pricing strategy and where maybe it's most prevalently used. So in what sectors or situations do you most frequently consult in?
Maybe I'll take your question in two parts, because your first part is where's pricing used? Pricing is, of course, used everywhere. Everywhere there's a transaction or, what I call value exchange, and pricing is in those situations, right? Pricing exists as a way to transfer value. I tend to do more work in financial services and software and technology space these days. Although in the past, I've also done work in retail, travel, and a few adjacent sectors.
Software is very interesting to do pricing strategy in. I recall, and this was when I was more on the investment banking side, I recall a software entrepreneur talking about the sales process in front of a client, and at that moment trying to provide a price to the prospective client. And he quickly saw that he started off too low and then reverted and went like tripled the price, and the client still said yes. So he had no idea how much he could price the software because there's tremendous value, right, and efficiency that could be saved. How do you approach this? I know it's a broad-based question, but maybe thinking about a software product.
Yeah, so this is an interesting example that you just raised. I'll tell you an even more prominent example, which is OpenAI, ChatGPT, because Sam Altman, one of the founders, recently admitted, I think in two public interviews, one with Bloomberg and the other I forgot, but it's one of those financial news sites, where he basically said that in the two pay tiers that ChatGPT has, the $20 tier and the $200 tier, in both of those cases, they didn't do extensive research to determine the price tag. It was mostly him intuiting the price tag. And I think he also admitted that they weren't making a lot of money from these tiers, or rather they were maybe not profitable, right, in these tiers. So it kind of goes to show, even for one of the world's most prominent companies these days, they don't always do pricing correctly.
Mm-hmm. And so what's the right way to go about thinking of pricing? And I mean, as you mentioned, pricing is everywhere, right? And it's frequently, I imagine, the intuition of the person pricing rather than anything scientific. And it could be applied to anything. It could be like going to a restaurant and like, how's that dish priced? Or it's like we talked about software, or it could be drug pricing, which could have the most variability. So are there standard ways to approach a pricing of certain services or goods?
Yeah, so it's a great question, because when you think about pricing, usually people would jump to the dollar sign right away, or in certain sectors like financial services, there's the percent sign, which is the rate that they charge, right? So people tend to kind of gravitate immediately towards how much you charge. I would say before you get there, how you actually charge is a much more important question to answer first. And so if you think about software industry that you were using as an example, in fact, we're actually in the midst of an interesting kind of a trend where a lot of the software companies are moving away from the classic flat subscription fee. So if you think about, B2B software industries and, usually it's like a per seat per month or per seat per quarter, per seat per year, kind of a flat subscription fee that doesn't really capture the usage pattern of their services. And they're actually moving into the direction of at least a hybrid model where they still keep the flat subscription, but then on top of that, they try to monetize on some level of usage. Like, for example, if you're a data company, the amount of data that's being accessed obviously will vary for different users of your product. So they would have subscription, and then, on top of that, they would charge for some kind of a usage, right? So that is an interesting trend, and it's actually happening as we speak, and more companies are in the software sector are adopting these hybrid models. And there are many other examples I would mention would be more relevant on the consumer side is, I would say a few months ago, maybe last year, there was news from Wendy's, which is one of the well-known quick service restaurant chains, right? They announced that they want to, deploy what is called dynamic pricing for their menu items. It didn't go down too well for them, and they had to backtrack from it. Well, first they had to explain that they didn't mean to introduce this mechanism so they can increase prices, but rather they want to decrease prices. But consumers weren't really buying that, and eventually they had to back off from this idea. So this goes to show that there are pricing models which fit certain industries well. And if you were to introduce that kind of a pricing model for your industry and it actually doesn't fit, or it requires a huge amount of consumer education to actually accept, you might run the risk of being rejected by the consumer. So dynamic pricing is not a new concept. We all know that because we experienced that pricing model in the travel industry, airlines, for example, hotel, rental cars, and it's okay if those industries are using it. I mean, of course, those industries, it took them decades, right, to educate the customers to expect that kind of a pricing model. But if you were to use it to restaurant, which is also a B2C industry and it's adjacent, unfortunately, it doesn't quite work. So it's a lesson for companies to kind of watch out for one, pricing model changes that happen in their industry. And secondly, how fast can you actually initiate that change?
Mm-hmm. The other thing that's interesting about travel is that frequently the pricing will just be like the basic price. And then everyone knows they tack on all these other fees. It could be like a resort fee, and then it's the extra taxes and it's local stuff. And maybe that's more of an obvious statement. You would never lead with like the all-in cost because then people would just like walk away. But it is annoying, I think, for most consumers when they see the final bill. It's like
Yeah.
they kind of knew it was going to be in there, but they didn't know the extent to which it would be in there. How much of pricing should be about first thinking about the consumer and what their experience is going to be like?
So, of course, if you want to be a successful business, you should always think about consumers and you should think about the psychology as well. And to your point, in those cases, you could argue that, yeah, the customer is already there and it's very hard for them to back off. And if it's a prevalent kind of a practice for the industry, they eventually have to accept it. But certainly they're not happy about it the first time around. That might impact their perception of your brand. So there's going to be some balance that you would have to do as a company between the revenue objectives that you have, which is directly influenced by pricing, to the consumer reactions afterwards. So, in other words, do you actually get repeat purchases? So it's not just a one-off game that you're playing here. And I would also say that psychology is a very interesting topic in the world of pricing, precisely because, we as human beings, from a kind of a decision-making standpoint, there's a lot of literature and research done on how humans like to make decisions. And it turns out that we can both be rational and irrational. Rational meaning do the homework, spend the effort, spend the mental energy to make the right decision for yourself. But that requires a lot of time and effort. And the irrational part is sort of an approximate decision where you don't have to be super accurate in getting to the right answer. It's good enough and it sort of expends the least amount of energy. I think this framework is called System 1, System 2 thinking. And it turns out that we're capable of doing both, but on average, we prefer to do System 1, which is sort of the approximate thinking, whereas System 2 is the more accurate thinking because it expends less energy. So if you're recognizing that, which is all of us, then, price it correctly, it can evoke the right kind of emotion, and then customer is happy. You as a company has made the money. Whereas if you don't do it correctly, it will have the opposite effect.
When we talk about psychology, there's this element of, I mean, I think it's related to what you're saying, is sometimes if a good is actually priced too low, it can influence someone in thinking that it's a cheap good, even though it could be very high quality. And seeing a very expensive good, thinking of luxury goods, makes one think like, oh, this is great. This is luxury. I'm getting a lot of value. Even when the value may not actually be there, that good could have cost 10% of what it's priced at. It'd be interesting to hear, like, if you do work in the luxury space and if there's fascinating case examples of just how much you can charge in the luxury space.
Well, first of all, I'll mention, because you mentioned pricing and value, the Latin word for price is pretium, which also means value. So, say ancient Romans actually figured this out very quickly in their language, whereas in the English language we have two different words for price and value. And so, yes, indeed, price is oftentimes an indicator of value. And in luxury products, I mean, one of the things that luxury brands don't tend to do is discount their products. Of course, sometimes they have these outlet channels where they liquidate their products cheaply, but if you go into a typical store of a luxury brand, you will never see discount tags. Whereas if you go to like a department store like Macy's or Bloomingdale's, and even like Bloomingdale's is on the higher end, but even in those stores, their customer base is facing the masses. You do tend to see discount tags, right? So there is a difference there. And the reason why they don't discount is because they think discounting will actually hurt the brand image. On the flip side, you also mentioned, when it gets too cheap, like people will actually start to question the quality of the products. And that's also true. In fact, in pricing research, we have a methodology called Van Westendorp, where it kind of tests the sensitivity of pricing, on the individual customer base. And there's a series of questions that this sort of Van Westendorp methodology tends to ask for, from things like, well, how expensive do you think this will make you feel? And yet you will still buy. But then on the cheap side is actually exactly that question, like how cheap does it get before you start to question the quality of the products that you will receive, right? So everybody in their head has some kind of a reference price, and it's not just one number, it's actually a range that you can actually tease out through a methodology like that.
Yeah. There's a lot of products out there where it's so hard to discern. There's consultancies that have come up, for example, in the life sciences space that have done really well because they cater to all the pharma companies, life sciences. And it seems like the swing is huge in terms of what you could price at, like several $100s, versus, less than 100 versus like thousands of dollars for a drug. I don't know if you have experience in pharma, but I'm curious, when the swing is that wide, what kind of an analysis do you do to hone in on the right range?
Yeah, so I don't have direct experience in pharmaceutical products, but there's a general question that you have raised, which is if you're actually launching, let's say, a new product, so you don't actually have any experience in the market to see whether the price is correct or not, how do you even price for it? Right. So, I mean, it turns out that, this is a fundamental issue in what I would call monetizing innovation. Well, first of all, there's a statistic I could cite based on research a few years ago, where 72% of new product launches actually fail to achieve the revenue target that they set out to achieve. And that's a pretty bleak statistic, because if you think globally, regardless of whether it's pharmaceutical industry, which certainly is one of the industries that actually spend a lot of R&D dollars on it, right? A lot of the industries actually spend a lot of R&D dollars on it, on new products. And the fact that the failure rate is so high is a pretty depressing thing to look at. And why that is the case, of course, there are many reasons, but I think pricing, for the most part, is one of the important reasons in contributing to why the products fail, because oftentimes they don't think about pricing, for example, early enough in the product development cycle. They don't think about the consumer early enough in the product development cycle, and that has contributed to the failure. So it kind of comes down to, if you think about how you want to launch a successful product and price it correctly, doing that kind of research is important. Now, going back to your original question of, essentially a new product is being launched and there could be a wide range of prices you can choose from. Like, how do we actually set that price? For new product launches, there are reference prices you can get at, which might be either similar products or adjacent products or a combination thereof. So think about, let's use a concrete example. In 2007, the first generation of iPhone was introduced to the market, right? And if you listen to Steve Jobs' pitch at the time, this is not like your average phone. Smartphones existed. There were like these Windows phones, and I think, even BlackBerry existed. Or Palm Pilot, I think it was one of those earlier kind of a smartphones. So smartphones existed, but iPhone is a sort of a revolutionary product. How did they set the prices? If they were to do the research, kind of using consumer-oriented techniques that I just mentioned, they will probably find that, a customer looking at an iPhone first think it's a phone and it's a smartphone. So it's not just your normal phone. And there are other smartphones in the market that they can use as reference price. And then here you have a smartphone product that has, additional features, and some of those are very revolutionary. And so the anchor points might be other phone products that are out there. But because of the significant value that you're adding, the App Store and such, they will then adjust their willingness to pay, if you will, up accordingly based on that baseline. And that baseline is still another type of phone. So things like that, would be one of the techniques, right, in determining pricing. There are, of course, other ways of determining pricing, and it applies especially in the B2B world. If you are a workflow management software company, you help a company actually save a lot of money by using their software to automate certain things. And, that kind of economic value could actually be quantified and then maybe translated, at least as an input, if not directly, as a way of pricing, right? So I mentioned data companies before. This was a case study a few years ago. We did a piece of work for a data company that served the oil and gas industry. So they, have shipping data and, purchase information and so forth, transactional information. So they serve that as data sets. Now, if you imagine you have two kind of customers, one is the oil and gas traders, like a physical traders of these products, and one is a financial trader of these products. So they work for hedge funds and trading desks and investment banks. Both of them are going to consume the same kind of a data, but maybe in different frequencies. Like the financial traders want more near real-time access, whereas the physical trader, is okay with more delayed. And the value they generate are going to be different because the use cases are different. So naturally, you should be thinking about pricing them differently. And if you don't, then you're certainly leaving money on the table.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. I feel like we could go on and on in different scenarios and talk about the pricing dynamics. We are coming up on time, but I did want to talk about your background because it's very interesting. I mean, you have a PhD in pricing. Tell us about your academic background all the way leading through your career track record.
So I did a PhD. It's not officially called pricing, but effectively the thesis was on pricing and revenue management topics. Mm-hmm. So it's probably not surprising. My professional career afterwards is mostly about pricing. And I think my PhD was also unusual in the sense that it wasn't the typical kind of theoretical PhD, and it was not an academic set of topics that I was going after. And I actually did a bunch of projects in very practical settings. One of them was actually a piece of work I did at Disney on what is called merchandise placement observation. So you've been to any of the Disney stores after 2007, you were subjected to the wrath of my PhD thesis, effectively. And so it's probably not surprising afterwards, I decided to kind of go into consulting, which is, another field that, solves practical problems. And I was mostly doing pricing consulting for the last, I want to say 17 years at this point.
Is there a favorite example where it doesn't have to be this specific example where you were able to come into a client, like analyze how they were pricing their goods or services and dramatically improve their top line just by moving different levers or aspects to the pricing?
So the top line improvement from pricing varies quite a bit from industry to industry. But what I've observed very interestingly is that in the B2C industries, the improvement tend to be in the range of 5 to 10% in top line improvement. In B2B industries, especially software, the number could become much, much bigger. Like, we're talking about 20, 30, 40% improvement. And why that is the case on the B2B side is because of discounting being involved. Every time you have discounting, The sales team is usually doing what they can to close the deal. And if you analyze the data, you see a lot of inefficiencies in terms of how they discount it and whether that actually follows any logic reason. Like, for example, bigger the client, you would expect bigger discount, but that's not usually the case. So that's sort of what I want to say. It's like very interesting observations. And this 5% on the consumer side seems to magically pop up in many different industries in the consumer sectors that I've seen, like from, travel to retail. And, I think the reason why it may be smaller is because a lot of those companies also tend to be bigger consumer sort of oriented firms, whereas the software space, these tend to be mid-sized companies, so relatively smaller. So you could also imagine, the bigger you are, the growth potential will drop. But because the base is big, the dollar improvement is still pretty dramatic.
Mm-hmm. I've got two final questions. Maybe since we're up on time, we'll do it in rapid fire. So one question is, can you tell us about a person who has had a profound influence on you?
I want to say it's a fictional character. It's Star Trek's Captain Jean-Luc Picard. Maybe this is a childhood thing, but he's adventurous. He certainly has the right moral character and, is sort of a childhood fictional hero.
Excellent. Last question. Can you tell us about a charity cause or other endeavor that you're passionate about?
So I am involved in recently some work on math education for both kind of underprivileged communities as well as, immigrant communities. And I have a PhD. I did actually a quantitative PhD. So math is kind of comes naturally. But I've encountered many situations where you go to a grocery store and the person at the checkout couldn't actually do basic algebra correctly. And I feel like that, is fundamental. And I also do a lot of work in financial services. As you can imagine, financial well-being and just basic financial education is so important. Like people in this country don't even understand how interest accumulates. And if, especially as a country with the largest amount of credit card debt in the world, you think kind of getting into basic kind of financial education is more. So it's kind of going from basic math to financial education. I'm generally pretty passionate about these areas.
Excellent. Wei, thank you so much for taking the time. It's been a pleasure to chat with you.
Yeah. Nice to meet you, RJ. Glad to be here.